Hi folks, in this video I would like to spend a few minutes to orient us towards the article Rule-Consequentialism by Brad Hooker. So in this article, Hooker will argue for rule consequentialism and against act consequentialism. Now, consequentialism is the main category of moral theories and has a lot of different things underneath it. Consequentialism in moral theories is the view that the thing that matters about an ethical action, our ethical actions, are the consequences of the action. That's the most important part. Let me step back for just a moment and say that in thinking about how to think about, let me say something about how to think about ethical theories. Let me put it that way. So we all grow up with a kind of common sense morality, and people do this around the world. People generally don't study ethical theories. We have common sense moralities: don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, things like this. Pretty universal, and it's been that way for a long time without much change. What ethical theories are, they are precisifications, they are formalizations of parts of our common sense morality that seem especially important to the theorist. So they take a value, they take a property of what we already do in our common sense morality, and they develop that property into a full theory. Now, the reason for that is because, for one thing, our common sense morality is often contradictory. There's often things in our common sense morality that pulls us in both directions. Also, common sense morality a lot of times won't be specific enough for us to know what to do in specific situations and how to act. Just an example would be in healthcare situations. A lot of times the types of situations that you're in healthcare are very specific. And so ethical theories are meant to help us to decide how to make the best decisions for our fellow human beings, and so that if we all acted that way, then the world will be a better place. Okay, so that's consequentialism is the category of ethical theories that says the most important aspect to our moral actions, our moral behavior, are the consequences of that behavior. Now, what else could it be, you might ask? Well, something else it could be is the motive behind our behavior. Now, that motive kind of ethics is also called duty ethics, as in doing one's duty no matter what the consequences is the most important part of an ethical behavior. And the Greek for duty is deon, and so deontology, the study of duty, is what Kantian ethics falls under. So deontological theories, deontological just means study of duty, is underneath that falls Kantian ethics, named after Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German philosopher. He's best known in ethics for his view on that what makes an act most important is the decision that we make the right decision, that we will the right course of action based on the rule or law that we're following. So the moral law, the moral rule that we're following is most important. And his whole philosophy of ethics revolves around that. It's a little complicated. I won't cover it now, but in a future video, I'll talk about that, and we'll read about that later. But now we're talking about consequentialism, and under consequentialism, the consequentialism is the main category. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. So consequentialism is the theory that says, that explains moral actions as being important insofar as the consequences of the action are important. To be more specific, utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism, so utilitarians think the consequences of the act are the most important part of an act to determine whether it's moral or not. But they define those consequences in terms of utility. Another word you can think of for utility is benefit. And the most famous utilitarianism, which you have already read, is that of utilitarians like Mill or Bentham, where it's a kind of hedonistic utilitarianism that says pleasure or happiness, which to them meant the same thing. Happiness was a pretty narrow concept that meant something like feeling good, although other kinds of well-being could be used in terms of utility. But it was about well-being and the escape from suffering. Those were the most important parts of morality. So if you perform an act, so let me put it this way, if you have two acts that you're considering doing, for a utilitarian, what matters is which act produces the greatest consequences, okay? So for an act utilitarian, the way to decide between two acts, say A and B, two acts, which act am I going to perform? It's going to be the one that results in the most utility versus unutility. So the best pleasure versus displeasure, most happiness over pain. So that's utilitarianism. Now, when the way Hooker defines it in this article, consequentialism is a broader concept that says that it's not just well-being, that sometimes you just can't make a good decision based on well-being, so a tiebreaker is equality and perhaps some other considerations. So he likes to use the term consequentialism instead of utilitarianism because he thinks utilitarianism, which falls under the category of consequentialism, is too narrow of a concept. So he likes the broader concept, consequentialism. So that's what we're going to use in talking about this article. Act consequentialism would have us decide the best consequences act per act. Rule consequentialism would have us decide what the best rule is, so we would act under the rule that produces the best consequences overall. So he brings out an interesting point, that is that consequentialists will sometimes argue that to be a good consequentialist, it's often good to not calculate the consequences, okay? There's a reason for this. You want, as a consequentialism, for the best outcomes of your actions, whether you're using rule or act to decide what to do. But you always want to have the best consequences. Well, it's not contradictory to think that one way to do that, or the best way to do that, is to not take the time to calculate the consequences in each individual case, or even according to the rule. That it's better to just act according to the common sense morality, right, that we all share. And he gives three reasons for this. One is that we lack information a lot of times that would give us the best course of action, that would tell us which the best course of action is to take, even according to consequentialism, that we lack the time, as I said, And also that a lot of times that social scientists tell us that we are so full of bias. We have bias and often make the wrong decisions because we exaggerate the course of action that would be in our own interest. So he also makes next a distinction in rule consequentialism between compliance with a rule and acceptance of a rule. So the difference between compliance and acceptance is really just if there's a rule, like say, always keep your promises, then I can comply with the rule by just sort of following the rule, by just always keeping my promises. Accepting the rule is something a little deeper. Hooker argues that it essentially means internalizing the rule. So I can internalize the rule, if I can internalize the rule so that I don't even think about it. I don't have to think about the rule. It doesn't take me any time to act. It's just how I act. It becomes part of my nature, part of my character. Then it has some benefits. One is it doesn't take a long time to figure out in each case how I'm supposed to comply with the rule. And in another way, people can get to know that this is just how I am. I don't break my promises. So it sort of never becomes a problem for me. He uses an example. I think it's, say I was following the rule, and he's not recommending that people have this rule, but say that I'm following a rule like always fight back when I'm being challenged or something like that. So he's just saying there that if I comply with the rule, I have to always act that way. But if I just internalize that so that it becomes so part of my personality that people just know that, they may never challenge me, so I don't ever have to actually comply with the rule because they just know that's how I am. Interesting idea. He discusses how he discusses the possibility of, does rule utilitarianism just collapse into act utilitarian? He talks about how rule consequentialism is argued just to fall into act consequentialism. And for one way that it does that pretty easily to understand is if the only rule that a rule consequentialist uses is always perform that act that results in the highest amount of consequences, the best consequences. So that would just be act consequentialism. But he says morality is a kind of a social code, right? There's a kind of definition out there about morality. Some folks think morality is like whatever people happen to want to do. This is kind of a new idea. I think in a lot of cases it's a kind of incoherent idea. And the reason is because for centuries, morality has been thought of, and actually the word is based on the idea of a social code. It's like something we all follow. And if everyone's just doing their own thing, arguably that's not morality, that's just people acting in their own interest, or they're just doing whatever they feel like doing. It's hard to see how someone would use reasoning to reason out what the right thing to do would be in any case if it's all just subjectively relativistic. So where moral theories come from, as I said before, they arise from the attractive general ideas that people have about morality. So rule consequentialism, this is a benefit that Smart argues is, not Smart, that Hooker argues, benefit is that rule consequentialism, he says, concurs with our intuitive moral beliefs, agrees with our intuitive moral beliefs. And it really sort of it answers the question of what the best moral theory would be, according to Hooker. And one way that he discusses this, and the main way, and the thing that I'll close with here, is that absolutism would have us acting in the same way no matter what all the time, right? It could be that a lot of people, and Smart, I think, is actually one that thinks that to be a rule consequentialist is to act according to certain rules the same way all the time, no matter what. At least it sounds like Smart acts that way in his paper, Extreme and Restricted Utilitarianism. But there's obviously a problem with absolutism, because there's going to be times when, of course, we want to have exceptions to the rules. And then act consequentialism, in a way, is too loose, because if someone is going around just maximizing consequences everywhere they go, then they will not be trustworthy. They want, because we'll observe these people who are act consequentialists. Sometimes they lie, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they hurt people, sometimes they don't. It all depends on the consequences at the time, and that could actually be damaging. Hooker thinks that could be very damaging overall for the society, to have people going around acting. We don't want a society full of act consequentialists, he thinks. But what we do want, according to Hooker, would be rule consequentialism with very few rules, as few as possible, but also rules that would be exceptions to other rules. So say, for instance, a case where we had a witness or somebody who knew, where a lot of times in ethics, we talk about like bomb cases, so there's a bomb, it's hidden somewhere. How do we decide what to do with the person who apparently knows? So a lot of people will be killed unless we torture this person to find out where the bomb is. So what do? Well, for rule consequentialists, unlike what J.J.C. Smart says, rule consequentialists, according to Hooker, could hold that torturing is wrong, except in cases where a big disaster could happen. And we could have disaster exception rules that would be compatible with a small set of other rules, so that we wouldn't get ridiculous circumstances like Smart would think we would have, where if he had a case of not lying, that I should keep my promise to a person on a desert island about giving their money to a jockey club versus giving it to a hospital. Smart, who is the act utilitarian, thinks that there would be a problem with rule utilitarianism or rule consequentialism, either one, because the rule, keep your promises, would prevent the person from giving the money to a hospital where it would do the most good, rather than the jockey club. Hooker says, no, that's ridiculous. We can have rules that are exception case rules, and that should take care of that particular problem. I hope that this video has been some help to you in understanding this very interesting article, Rule-Consequentialism by Brad Hooker. Thank you for your time and attention. Bye-bye.